We are initiating proceedings against Mrs. Meghan Markle. Her statements during broadcasts, especially the Oprah conversation, have caused excessive damage to the royal household. An apology is no longer adequate. This situation will now advance through the Gadi. The pen made contact with paper for mere moments, yet what it documented would transform the royal household permanently. Within a restricted chamber at Buckingham Palace, King Charles authorized an extraordinary directive, irrevocably removing Meghan's designation as Duchess of Sussex. No formal event occurred, no advance public notification, and no room for discussion. Before the paperwork departed the King's workspace, one of the most contentious royal disputes of recent times had crossed its threshold. Before we explore what this truly signifies for the royal household, ensure you subscribe so you won't miss any developments. Charles stayed seated following the authorization, examining the closing section as if the text might alter. The directive was an instruction issued through the sovereign's power, which meant it carried the ruling into royal documentation and practice. It accomplished more than eliminating a form of address. It removed one of Meghan's final observable connections to the establishment she had departed, and eliminated a designation that held power well beyond Britain. The king reviewed the passages twice, then positioned both palms against the workspace. He recognized the ruling would injure Harry, possibly beyond restoration. Still, delay presented its own risk. Each postponement made the crown seem indecisive. Each concession diminished the line between royal obligation and personal goals. And each public application of the Sussex designation perpetuated the dispute. Quietness filled the chamber. Just a small group had known the paperwork existed, and even high-ranking household members had been excluded until the authorization was finalized. Charles had demanded secrecy because one disclosure could initiate pressure, discussion, or an effort to modify the ruling before completion. He wanted accountability to belong to him exclusively. A secondary provision intensified the directive even further. Harry and Meghan would encounter fresh restrictions on presenting their royal association in subsequent broadcasts, business endeavors, philanthropic efforts, and public events. The section did not simply address the past. It was structured to regulate what followed. Charles secured the container, set aside his spectacles, and released his breath. "It is complete," he stated. The assistant near the entrance advanced, received the paperwork, and departed without additional words. The substantial entrance closed following him, converting private determination into unchangeable action. Beyond the Atlantic, Meghan assumed the designation stayed hers. She had no awareness that one authorization had altered the terminology of all future declarations, every mention, and all public confrontations yet to happen. However, before the information arrived in California, those nearest to the ruling would be compelled to face what that designation had represented, and what its elimination could shatter. Beyond the constitutional terminology and royal insignia stood three individuals confined within a household injury that had never recovered. Charles perceived a monarchy facing assault. Meghan perceived a designation she assumed she had obtained through hardship. Harry perceived the final emblem of the existence he had previously maintained with his household. The directive appeared procedural, yet its actual significance was devastatingly personal. A father had selected the crown, a spouse confronted public degradation, and a son was approaching another abandonment. Charles experienced the pressure of both positions bearing against him. As sovereign, he held accountability for safeguarding the monarchy's reputation and guaranteeing that royal standing could not be detached permanently from royal obligation. As a father, he comprehended that eliminating Meghan's designation could obliterate what remained of his connection with Harry. The Sussex identification was beyond a designation. It was a royal standing provided through union, delivering public acknowledgement, authority, and an enduring association to the establishment the pair had abandoned. Harry obtained the alert before the formal communication reached him. A previous courtier, communicating through a secure encrypted transmission, informed him the directive had progressed beyond conversation. The Duke seized the surface of a neighboring table and poses the single question that held importance. Has he authorized it? The quietness on the opposite end responded initially. When verification arrived, he dropped his head and remained speechless. Meghan appeared moments afterward and halted when she observed her husband's expression. She understood immediately that something permanent had transpired. Shock crossed her features, yet it rapidly transformed into composure. She requested to examine every portion of the palace transmission, then reviewed the initial passages without seating herself. For her, the forfeiture threatened beyond status. It affected the standing she had maintained into broadcasts, ventures, public events, and a fresh existence established distant from Britain. William did not rejoice. Throughout a recorded palace discussion, he maintained that royal designations could not stay protections against disapproval while being employed without the accountability that provided them significance. The prince assumed hesitation would compromise the crown's power and establish a harmful precedent for the future. Nevertheless, he recognized Harry would interpret his stance not as institutional prudence, but as another betrayal. Camilla possessed similar concerns. In a confidential exchange documented in a household record, she cautioned Charles that the public would observe one authorization, not the months of tension preceding it. The Queen Consort recognized he would accept the responsibility exclusively, although counselors, legal authorities, and high-ranking relatives had influenced the ruling. Harry believed the directive targeted him equally as Meghan. To the Duke, his father had selected institutional continuation over restoration. Still, the authorization was not the genuine origin. Weeks prior, a restricted recording from a confidential royal assembly had arrived to the king, and what it revealed had rendered postponement unacceptable. All royal crises possess a moment that subsequently appears unavoidable, the point when confidential bitterness becomes permanent action. For Charles, that point arrived throughout a restricted gathering at Windsor Castle, where deliberately selected attendees assembled under firm guidelines that nothing addressed would become public. Still, before midnight, a confrontation concerning Meghan, Harry, and a high-ranking palace official converted years of strain into something considerably more threatening. What transpired within that chamber became the immediate catalyst for the directive, authorized weeks subsequently. Charles had permitted the strain to extend for years because he still assumed quietness might preserve a route toward his son. Palace authorities had tolerated broadcasts, business ventures, and continuous disapproval, anticipating limitation would avert another public conflict. The Windsor gathering was intended to evaluate that anticipation. It was a confidential restoration assembly, signifying a restricted meeting, structured to resolve household dispute without cameras, declarations, or external tension. Communication devices were relinquished, assistants stayed beyond the primary chamber, and all attendees were instructed that the exchange would stay restricted. Meghan altered the environment with one statement. Throughout a conversation about subsequent public activities, she declared that Duchess of Sussex would stay her lasting worldwide standing, independent of palace resistance, royal obligations, or fresh limitations. A high-ranking courtier responded steadily that the designation originated from the crown and could not function beyond the power that provided it. She withdrew her seating, gazed directly toward Charles, and responded that the designation now connected to her public existence and could not merely be retracted. Harry advanced before anyone else could answer. He positioned himself between his spouse and the courtier, charging the palace of attempting to remove his household while appearing to pursue harmony. His tone intensified. Meghan declined to moderate her statements. The Duke restated that the designation symbolized their union, their offspring, and the future they had established outside Britain. Within moments, the assembly structured to restore confidence had deteriorated into the precise dispute everyone feared. Charles listened to the conversation again, several days following through a restricted security recording established to record dangers and safeguard those present at the assembly. He stopped the recording at Meghan's statement and remained isolated for several moments. The king no longer interpreted the disagreement as misunderstanding over procedure. Royal distinctions were privileges provided by the sovereign, and her statements appeared like a straightforward opposition to whether the monarch maintained authority over them. Another finding strengthened his determination. A recorded business presentation arrived at the palace, revealing strategies for a substantial global venture, established notably around the Sussex designation. Postponement now possessed a timeline. Once declared, any action would appear retaliatory and feeble. Charles requested Harry before the suggestion could advance. He would present one closing concession, yet not through counselors or legal communications. The final opportunity would transpire directly between an injured father and a son. Persuaded the palace had previously selected the crown over him. No assistance remained between them. No cameras remained outside. When Harry accessed the king's confidential sitting chamber, he discovered just his father, 2 untouched water containers, and the incomplete directive positioned within a dark container. Charles had requested him for one closing exchange before rendering the ruling lasting. What transpired was not a procedural royal assembly. It was a confrontation between a sovereign protecting the establishment and a son insisting that his spouse be acknowledged as household rather than a danger. Charles requested him to remain seated, yet the Duke stayed standing. He previously recognized what the container held. The directive was a procedural instruction issued through the monarch's power, signifying it could modify how Meghan's designation was acknowledged and employed in formal royal existence. The king selected his terminology deliberately. He stated the identification could not persist to suggest royal power, while the pair rejected the obligations, boundaries, and public accountability connected to that power. Harry's composure fractured almost immediately. He charged his father of disciplining Meghan because she had declined to stay silent. He stated the palace had converted every disagreement into a devotion evaluation and every disapproval into an assault on the crown. To him, this was not regarding regulations. It was regarding degradation. Charles responded with a quieter frustration. He stated the matter was not quietness, yet responsibility. Confidential household suffering had continuously been transported into broadcasts, public declarations, and business ventures, positioning the monarchy beneath constant tension. The king reminded him that all royal designations possessed institutional significance, and that significance could not be employed without accountability. Harry obtained the container. He reviewed the initial statement, then positioned it down so sharply that one of the water containers shook against the table. The noise penetrated through the chamber. He insisted to recognize whether the ruling had previously been rendered. Charles provided him one closing selection. Meghan could maintain a confidential social association to the Sussex designation, yet she would need to cease employing it commercially and in procedural public presentation. The concession would maintain a personal connection while detaching it from royal power. It was limited, delicate, and obviously final. Harry dismissed it. He maintained that accepting those conditions would permit the palace to regulate his spouse's standing even following they had withdrawn from royal existence. His tone intensified again, yet his father did not respond similarly. Charles secured the container. His threshold arrived without raising his voice. He informed his son that dismissal departed him with no accountable option. The statements affected harder because they were communicated so quietly. Harry advanced toward the entrance, then reversed as if one closing statement might preserve them. Nothing arrived. The entrance secured, and the king stayed beside the incomplete directive, recognizing the household confrontation had unsuccessful. Now the ruling would transfer into the apparatus of royal authority and into the possession of those who assumed the crown could no longer permit compassion. The directive possessed one authorization, yet the tension preceding it originated from all sections of the royal establishment. High-ranking councillors feared that the Sussex designation had become a competing identity. Constitutional authorities worried that persistent uncertainty would compromise the crown's authority over its own distinctions. William perceived an unaddressed danger to the monarchy's future. Still, amid the legal contentions and tactical cautions, stood a visibly exhausted Charles, compelled to determine whether safeguarding the establishment demanded forfeiting the final delicate anticipation of harmony with his son. William stopped outside the assembly chamber before the critical assembly commenced. He revealed his prepared statements, reviewed them once more, then eliminated a statement he feared appeared personally aggressive toward Meghan. The prince wanted the separation to stay apparent. A royal designation was not merely a household designation. It was a distinction provided by the sovereign, connecting its possessor to public obligation and the standing of the crown. To him, the matter was accountability, not retaliation. The restricted entrances brought the tension into concentration. Constitutional counselors, communications authorities, and high-ranking household members had constructed a recorded suggestion declaring that endless uncertainty could no longer persist. Each Sussex-identified broadcast or endeavor threatened suggesting royal authorization where none functioned. That held importance because the public might struggle to detach confidential business operation from the power of the monarchy, while subsequent successors could receive an establishment incapable to regulate its own standing. William selected his terminology deliberately when his opportunity arrived. He stated subsequent generations could not receive a crown in which royal identifications functioned of royal obligation. The subsequent king did not request degradation. He requested a limitation strong enough to endure the following crisis. Camilla stayed uneasy. In a confidential exchange documented in a household record, she questioned Charles whether lasting elimination would render restoration unachievable. The Queen Consort cautioned that an institutional achievement could become a lasting household failure. He listened to her, yet he also recognized that endless concession had previously intensified the injury. A more troubling detail then modified the conversation. The initial version had suggested just a temporary restriction, yet counselors had reviewed strategies for persistent global endeavors established around the Sussex standing. Their determination was direct. Temporary boundaries would encourage continuous disagreements and permit the dispute to reappear whenever a fresh venture surfaced. Charles listened as others debated his household in terminology of threat, precedent, and regulation. Then he elevated one palm, and the chamber became silent. The king stated no paperwork would be authorized unless the accountability remained openly with him. A secondary provision was included. Subsequent palace transmissions would no longer characterize Meghan by the Duchess identification, rendering the modification symbolic as well as procedural. The closing version was positioned before Charles, while a protected palace team arranged simultaneous alerts for Harry, Meghan, high-ranking royals, and substantial broadcasters. Once the authorization was included, approach became actuality, and in California, the initial communication reached before Meghan had any opportunity to arrange. The communication reached without formality. Meghan accessed it anticipating another procedural disagreement from London, yet the initial passage stopped her entirely. The designation she had employed for years was no longer hers. No temporary limitation existed, no assessment interval, and no request to discuss. Harry observed her review in quietness, as shock strengthened into frustration. The palace had not merely opposed their public standing, it had modified the limitation between them and the monarchy permanently. Meghan positioned at the kitchen surface and arrived at the lasting elimination section. She stopped, returned to the opening of the section, and reviewed it again more gradually. The formal alert was a straightforward palace transmission verifying how the Crown would document and acknowledge the modification. That held importance because the Duchess identification surfaced across scheduled declarations, philanthropic material, procedural requests, and business presentation. Eliminating it threatened both her public position and the framework of ventures previously arranged around the Sussex standing. The quietness fractured with one inquiry. Meghan reduced the communication device and gazed toward Harry. He actually authorized it? She reversed before he could respond. The procedural terminology was degrading, yet the personal abandonment penetrated deeper. Charles had not merely authorized a limitation. In her perspective, he had selected to remove the standing his own household had previously provided her. Harry experienced frustration intensifying beside responsibility. His unsuccessful assembly with the king had secured the closing route to concession, and he recognized it. The Duke feared that his spouse would now perceive him as ineffective against the identical establishment he had guaranteed they could withdraw from. He wanted to charge the palace. Still, part of him comprehended that his uncertainty had assisted bringing the crisis to their entrance. Meghan declined to appear defeated. She requested her nearest counselors, positioned the transmission at the center of the table, and instructed them to review all passages before any public declaration was distributed. Her team soon revealed the most immediate harm. A substantial media venture possessing notable Sussex presentation was scheduled to be declared within days. The arrangement of the directive disrupted the introduction before the world even recognized it functioned. Strain intensified when Meghan questioned whether Harry had recognized lasting elimination was achievable. He remained just a few moments before responding, yet those moments altered everything. She acknowledged the reality in his quietness. He had recognized the threat was genuine and had safeguarded anticipation instead of providing her caution. Beyond the palace, the outcomes extended just as rapidly. Personnel obtained fresh designation guidelines, formal pages were modified, and high-ranking royals were instructed to stay silent until Charles distributed a composed declaration. The king's transmission would clarify the ruling without reopening discussion. Meghan dismissed her counselors and stayed isolated with Harry. Neither raised their voice, neither protected themselves. The directive had created an injury within their union, as well as between two households. Still, in the calmness following the frustration, they confronted a selection more significant than any designation: oppose the monarchy again or finally advance beyond it. Hours following the counselors departed, and all public declarations were delayed, Meghan and Harry remained isolated. No palace authorities positioned between them. No legal representatives influenced their statements. Their communication devices stayed in another chamber beyond the access of declarations, cautions, and insistences. The directive still positioned on the table, yet the opposition surrounding it had modified. This was no longer just regarding Charles, procedure, or royal regulation. It was regarding who they would transform into without the standing they had protected for years. Harry remained opposite his spouse following midnight and remained for her to communicate. Meghan finally acknowledged that the elimination appeared like public removal. The designation had symbolized the existence she accessed, the hardships she assumed she rendered, and the authorization others had questioned from the opening. A royal identification was beyond a social classification. It was a procedural standing associated to the monarchy and acknowledged through formal employment. Forfeiting it signified that all subsequent events would possess verification that the palace had retracted that association. Meghan gazed at him and requested the reality without uncertainty. Harry admitted that lasting elimination had been achievable following his closing assembly with Charles. He had recognized the threat was genuine. Still, he could not compel himself to communicate it aloud. The Duke expressed regret for permitting anticipation to substitute honesty. He had wanted to assume his father would withdraw. Instead, his quietness had departed her unprepared. The frustration moderated, yet the suffering did not. Meghan acknowledged that another extended public conflict could absorb their household and convert all confidential injuries into material for outsiders. Harry responded with a more difficult admission. Opposing the palace had maintained him emotionally connected to the establishment he professed to have withdrawn from. All assault, all protection, all broadcast withdrew him toward the identical entrances he had departed from. Meghan rendered the ruling that modified everything. They would not introduce an immediate legal opposition or media counter-assault. They would distribute a controlled declaration recognizing the directive without relinquishing their worth. The selection was not pardon, it was regulation. Harry accessed the arranged version and discovered a page containing charges against Charles, William, and palace authorities. He reviewed the initial passages, eliminated the sheet, and separated it in portions. The action terminated beyond a section. It communicated that all injuries would no longer transform into another public confrontation. Charles obtained confidential notification through a protected communication before the declaration was distributed. The king reviewed it isolated and temporarily secured his vision. Their limitation had not restored confidence, yet it had averted the crisis from becoming even more harmful. The closing declaration surfaced beneath their personal designations, eliminated of royal terminology and open resistance. A fresh section had commenced without the standing they previously protected. Still outside their residence, the world was previously converting one royal authorization into a worldwide assessment. By sunrise in London, the confidential royal directive had transformed into a worldwide contention. Broadcasters interrupted scheduled transmission. Palace correspondents assembled beneath overcast atmospheres. Advocates described the king as determined, while disapprovers condemned the action as harsh and personal. Still, one representation captured the crisis more effectively than any debate. A publication front presentation, possessing Meghan's image beneath 4 substantial statements, no longer a duchess. In a single morning, a household injury had transformed into a worldwide assessment on monarchy, standing, and authority. An assembly collected outside Buckingham Palace around a publication platform, presenting Meghan's expression with the eliminated designation, eliminated in crimson. Some individuals elevated their communication devices. Others debated openly. The Duchess identification was not merely a social classification. It was a procedural royal standing connected to the crown and acknowledged through formal employment. Its vanishing held importance because it demonstrated that the directive had advanced beyond confidential frustration and into public actuality. A substantial broadcaster described it the most significant royal designation disagreement since Harry and Meghan departed formal obligations. The coverage clarified that the ruling permanently modified their association with the monarchy. Advocates stated Charles had finally protected the crown's limitations. Disapprovers perceived something more severe, a substantial establishment degrading a woman who had previously departed from royal obligation. William observed the coverage without audio. His expression tightened as commentators characterized him as a motivating power preceding the ruling. The prince had maintained for precision, yet the authorization connected to his father. He recognized public frustration, rarely acknowledged that separation, and he feared the narrative would intensify Harry's assumption that his sibling had assisted securing the palace entrances permanently. Camilla secured one publication closed before Charles could obtain it. She informed him not to review the personal assaults, yet the king had previously observed the declarations, describing him heartless, feeble, and retaliatory. The queen consort reminded him that public anger would transfer. He responded quietly that household assessment might not. Meghan and Harry's controlled declaration modified the atmosphere because it possessed no charges. Broadcasters dismissed predictions of immediate conflict and commenced questioning whether the pair had selected independence over retaliation. Their quietness refused the crisis another detonation. Still, it also rendered the palace action appear even more closing. Formal digital documentation modified within hours. Meghan's designation vanished from procedural mentions, public pages, and subsequent designation instruction. The directive was no longer an theoretical paperwork secured within royal facilities. It could be observed in all modified passages. Charles advanced toward a palace opening and listened to distant voices from the assembly. He did not gesture. He comprehended that any motion could appear like achievement, and this ruling had brought none. Public assessment stayed separated, yet the confidential struggle had arrived at its closing phase. The designation would not reappear. When the disturbance of the declarations diminished, the household would confront the lasting outcome and the emotional reality no formal paperwork could hide. The directive did not generate a victor. Charles maintained the power of the crown, yet forfeited another portion of his association with his son. Meghan forfeited a designation, yet obtained a closing detachment from the establishment that had characterized and injured her. Harry could no longer assume that restoration would return the existence he had relinquished. When the contentions terminated, the genuine determination was unmistakable. The monarchy had protected its limitations, yet all individuals concerned had compensated for that certainty. Charles returned to the chamber, where he had authorized the paperwork. He stopped beside the identical workspace, positioned one palm against the secured container, and requested an assistant to eliminate it from his observation. The royal collection was the protected assembly where significant crown documentation were maintained for posterity. Transmitting the directive there verified that the ruling was lasting. It would not stay nearby as a weapon, a caution, or a request to reopen the disagreement. The king did not regret safeguarding the monarchy's power. Royal standing possessed responsibilities because designations associated confidential individuals to public obligation, national confidence, and the standing of the sovereign. Still, he comprehended the personal expense. Harry would never again observe his father without recalling that authorization, and no constitutional contention could restore the separation it had established. Meghan confronted the fresh actuality without relinquishing herself to it. She authorized public materials possessing her personal designation exclusively and informed her team that subsequent activities must position without acquired royal importance. The designation was eliminated, yet her expression stayed. For the initial occasion, she could no longer evaluate her authority through a palace identification, and that forfeiture gradually transformed into a form of liberation. Harry arrived at his own difficult determination. He acknowledged that safeguarding his spouse and offspring demanded establishing an existence untouched by palace authorization, received position, or aspirations of returning. The Duke had occupied years opposing the establishment, while still remaining for it to accept him toward. Now that perception was completed. William gazed toward the future without rejoicing. The prince recognized institutional precision had been returned, yet he also comprehended what transpires when household dispute becomes constitutional action. The crown had strengthened its limitation while compromising the individual's position preceding it. Camilla communicated to Charles through a confidential exchange subsequently recorded in a household record. She informed him posterity might recall the directive as power, yet the household would always recall it as forfeiture. The queen consort remained for a response. He provided none. No reversal would exist, restored discussion, or return. Meghan advanced without the designation, yet not without worth. Harry forfeited the perception of reappearance, yet obtained a more apparent future. Charles protected the crown, while acknowledging that sovereignty could not restore a fractured household. The directive was secured eliminated. Both households persisted beneath detached standings, and the confrontation terminated permanently. The monarchy endured stronger in power, yet undeniably diminished in household. Thanks for observing. Please don't forget to appreciate and subscribe, and we will observe you in subsequent one.